Patrol 911.
Someone's trying to break into my house.
What city are you in, St. Paul?
I'm in St. Paul.
What address are you at?
Minnehaha Avenue.
Minnehaha, someone's trying...
Please, somebody has broken in our house. You shot me.
Okay, hold on a sec.
Are you in a house or an apartment?
The house.
What's the problem?
When I've been shot, somebody broke into our house. I've been shot.
Wait, you've been shot?
Yes, please.
Okay, stay on the phone with me, okay?
Okay.
Nick? Nick?
Yeah.
Stay on the phone with me. Who shot you?
I don't know if somebody broke into our house. No! I need somebody here now.
Right, we're getting help out there right now. Go ahead.
Well, you said your wife is shot also?
Yeah, she's not moving. She's not breathing. Oh, please.
Okay.
On the back.
Nick, take a slow, deep breath. I've got a lot of help coming.
She called 911 and said someone was breaking into her home. Seconds later, a gunshot was heard. But when police arrived, there was no sign of forced entry, and no one else inside the house. For years, that contradiction remained. A break-in with no evidence, a shooting with no witness. And a story that, at first, no one questioned. Welcome to Condemned Files. In today's case, we're looking at the story of Heidi Firkus. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. Now, let us get into it. April 25th, 2010, early morning in St. Paul, Minnesota. The streets are quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the day begins. Inside a small home, a 911 operator answers a call that, at first, sounds routine. On the other end is a woman. Her voice is steady, controlled, but there is tension beneath it, something held back, something trying not to surface. She says someone is trying to break into her home, not inside yet, but close enough to make her call for help. There is movement in the background. It is faint at first, then more noticeable. A shift in tone follows. The operator listens carefully, asking questions, trying to understand what is happening. The woman responds, but her focus seems divided, like her attention is somewhere else, somewhere just out of sight. Then everything changes. A gunshot. The sound cuts through the call without warning. It is sharp, immediate, unmistakable. And then silence. No scream, no explanation. Just a sudden end. The line remains open for a brief moment, but nothing follows. No movement. No voice, only the absence of both. Emergency responders are dispatched immediately, but by the time they arrive, the moment has already passed. Whatever happened inside that house is no longer unfolding. It is over. What remains is a recording, a call that captured the final seconds before a life was lost, a sequence of events that begins with fear and ends with silence, and in between, a single sound that changes everything. At that point, there is only one version of what happened. A woman called for help. Something interrupted that call, and whatever it was, it left no explanation behind. But as investigators would soon discover, what was heard on that call would become only the beginning of a much larger story. Not long after the first call ends, another call comes in to 911. This time, it is a man. His name is Nick Firkus. His voice carries urgency, but unlike the first call, there is a structure to what he is saying. He explains quickly, almost immediately, that someone broke into their home. He says there was a struggle. He says a shotgun went off during that struggle. He says both he and his wife were shot. The operator listens as he describes the situation. His words come in a sequence that feels organized, as though the events are already understood in his mind. There is no hesitation in the explanation, no uncertainty about what happened. He repeats that there was an intruder, that the person forced their way in, that everything that followed was the result of that intrusion. It sounds like a tragic home invasion. But even in those early moments, something about the explanation stands apart. The details are clear, but clarity does not always mean accuracy. Sometimes it means something else entirely, something prepared, something already formed before the questions begin. As responders make their way to the scene, this version of events becomes the first one recorded, the first one heard, and often the first story has power. It shapes expectations. It sets direction. It becomes the framework through which everything else is viewed. A break-in, a struggle, an accidental discharge. That is the story now. And at that moment, there is no reason to doubt it. But what is said in the immediate aftermath of an event does not always reflect what truly happened. Sometimes it reflects what someone needs others to believe. And as investigators would later find, the story presented in that second call would not match what they were about to see. Emergency responders arrive at the home in St. Paul within minutes. Police vehicles pull up outside, lights cutting through the quiet of the early morning. Officers move quickly toward the entrance, aware that a violent situation has just been reported. Inside, paramedics follow close behind, prepared for injuries, prepared for urgency. But the moment they step inside, something feels different. They find Heidi Firkus. She has been fatally shot. There is no movement from her, no signs of life. The situation for her is already over. Nearby, Nick Firkus is alive. He has a gunshot wound, but he is conscious. He is able to speak, able to describe what he says happened. He repeats the same explanation given during the call. An intruder broke in. There was a struggle. The gun went off. Paramedics begin treating him immediately. Officers begin securing the scene. Standard procedure follows, but even in those first moments, the environment does not match what they expected to find. There is no chaos, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, no visible signs of a violent struggle. The house is quiet, still, almost untouched. And that stillness begins to stand out, because in situations involving forced entry and confrontation, there are usually signs. Evidence of movement, evidence of resistance, something that shows what just happened. Here. There's very little of that. The contrast between the story and the scene is subtle at first, but it is there, and as officers begin to take in their surroundings, that contrast becomes harder to ignore. Because what they are seeing does not look like a home invasion. Once the immediate emergency response is complete, investigators begin a closer examination of the home. Their focus shifts from urgency to detail. Every part of the scene is now important. Every surface, every entry point, every object becomes part of a larger question. They start with the doors. Front door, back door, frames, locks. Everything is intact. There are no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no damage that would suggest someone forced their way inside. The doors appear as they should, secure and undisturbed. They move to the windows. Glass panels are checked carefully, edges examined, surroundings inspected for signs of tampering. Nothing, no broken glass, no cracks, no indication that anyone entered through a window. They continue through the home. Rooms are observed one by one. Furniture is in place. Objects are not scattered. There are no signs of a struggle, no evidence of panic, no indication that a violent confrontation moved through the space. It does not feel like a scene that was disrupted. It feels controlled, contained. And that becomes the problem, because the explanation describes a break-in, a confrontation, a struggle involving a weapon. But the environment does not reflect that kind of event. Instead, it presents something else entirely. Something quieter, something more deliberate. Investigators begin documenting everything. On photographs, notes, observations, every detail recorded exactly as it is found. Because when a scene does not match the story, the scene becomes the evidence. And in this case, the scene is not supporting the version of events that was given. With the initial examination complete, investigators widen their focus. If an intruder truly entered the home, there should be evidence beyond the immediate scene. Movement leaves traces. Presence leaves signs. And so, the search begins. They move methodically from room to room. Floors are inspected for footprints. Carpets are checked for impressions. Hard surfaces are examined for scuff marks or disturbances. Investigators look for anything out of place, anything that suggests someone unfamiliar moved through the home. Nothing stands out. They turn their attention to objects, drawers, cabinets, personal belongings. In a typical break-in, there are signs of searching, items displaced, drawers opened, valuables disturbed or missing. Here, everything appears untouched. Nothing seems to have been taken. Nothing appears to have been moved. The absence of disruption becomes its own form of evidence. Outside, the search continues. Officers examine the perimeter of the home, the yard, the surrounding area. Entry points are considered again, this time from the outside looking in. They search for signs that someone approached or left in a hurry. There are no clear tracks, no discarded items, no evidence of flight. If someone had been there, there should be something left behind. Some indication that a person entered, moved through the house, and then escaped. But there is nothing. And as that realization settles in, the question becomes harder to ignore. If there was an intruder, where is the evidence? Because at this point, the search has produced one consistent result. An absence, no signs of entry, no signs of movement, no signs of exit. And in a case built on the claim of a break-in, that absence becomes impossible to explain. As the search for an intruder produces no results, investigators begin focusing more closely on the weapon itself. The shotgun. It becomes a central piece of evidence. Every detail matters. They examine its condition, its placement, how it could have been handled in the moments leading up to the shot. They look at how the weapon operates, how it would need to be positioned, and what level of control would be required to fire it. Because according to the explanation given, there was a struggle, a chaotic moment, a situation where control would be uncertain. But the weapon tells a different story. Investigators begin analyzing angles, distance, the direction of the shot. They consider how the weapon would behave in motion and how it would behave if it were stable. These distinctions matter, because a weapon discharged during a struggle does not behave the same way as one that is controlled. And the findings begin to raise questions, not loud ones, not immediate conclusions, but quiet, persistent questions. Questions about whether the sequence described could physically happen the way it was told. They also consider the timing. The gunshot heard during the 911 call, the exact moment it occurred, how quickly everything followed. When a weapon is involved, timing becomes critical, because it connects actions to outcomes. And in this case, those connections do not align as clearly as expected. The more the weapon is examined, the less it supports the idea of an uncontrolled event. Instead, it suggests something more precise, more directed, more deliberate. And that possibility shifts the investigation further away from the original explanation, because if the weapon was not used in a struggle, then the story of a struggle begins to weaken. And when one part of a story weakens, everything connected to it begins to shift. With the scene examined and the weapon analyzed, investigators turn their attention to something just as important: time. Because in any case like this, the timeline becomes the backbone of everything. It connects actions to outcomes. It shows what happened, and just as importantly, what could not have happened. They begin with the first 911 call, the moment it started, the tone of the voice, the details provided. Then they focus on the exact second the gunshot is heard. That moment is fixed. It cannot be changed. It becomes a reference point. From there, they look at what follows: the silence, how long it lasts, what is not heard, no continued struggle, No movement. No additional voices. Just quiet. Then comes the second call, placed shortly after. And that timing becomes critical because it suggests a sequence, a defined order of events, not something scattered, not something unfolding unpredictably, but something that follows a pattern. Investigators begin mapping out those moments carefully, second by second. They ask how much time passed between the shot and the second call. What could realistically happen within that window? What actions would need to take place? And whether those actions align with the explanation given. Because in a real struggle, time behaves differently. There is unpredictability, delays, confusion. But here, the sequence appears tight, controlled, almost too precise. And that precision begins to stand out. Because when events happen in a way that feels structured, it raises the question of whether they unfolded naturally, or whether they followed a different kind of order, one that was not chaotic, but intentional. To understand what happened that morning, investigators also need to understand who Heidi Firkus was. Because victims are not just part of a case. They are people with lives, routines, and patterns, and those details matter. Heidi was 25 years old and newly married, at a point in life where things are usually just beginning. She was described by those who knew her as kind, responsible, and steady. Someone who followed structure, someone who valued stability, someone who was not known to take risks or place herself in unpredictable situations. Her daily life reflected that. Routine, consistency, a sense of order. There were no known threats against her, no ongoing conflicts that suggested danger, no reports of fear, nothing that indicated she believed someone might try to harm her. And that becomes important. Because when investigators look at motive, they begin with the victim. They ask who might want to cause harm. They ask whether there were any warning signs, any changes in behavior, any indication that something was wrong. And in Heidi's case, there is very little to suggest that. Her life from the outside appeared stable, predictable, safe. And that creates a contrast with the explanation of a break-in. Because random intrusions do happen, but they often come with signs, patterns, opportunities. In this case, none of those are immediately visible, which leads investigators to consider another possibility, that the answer may not come from outside the home, but from within it. To understand the situation more clearly, investigators begin looking at the relationship between Heidi and her husband, Nick Firkus. Because when a crime occurs inside a home, the people within that home become part of the picture. From the outside, their marriage appeared normal. There were no public reports of conflict, no visible signs of tension, no history of disputes that would suggest something was wrong. They were newly married, at a stage where life is often focused on building something together, a home, a routine, a future. And from what others could see, that is exactly what they were doing. They lived a relatively quiet life. There were no obvious disruptions, no sudden changes in behavior that raised concern, no outward indication that anything was unstable. But investigators know that appearances do not always reflect reality. What people see from the outside is often limited. Private situations remain private. Financial stress, personal pressure, unspoken problems. These things do not always show. And so, the investigation begins to move beyond what is visible. They start asking deeper questions about communication, about responsibilities, about what each person knew, and what they did not. Because in cases like this, understanding a relationship is not about what is seen. It is about what is hidden. And sometimes the most important details are the ones that are not immediately obvious. As investigators continue to examine the situation, they begin to consider whether there were factors within the marriage that had not yet been revealed. Because if the answer is not coming from outside the home, then it may be connected to something inside it. As investigators continue looking beyond the surface of the marriage, they begin uncovering something that had not been visible from the outside: a financial reality. The home that Heidi and Nick were living in was in foreclosure. Mortgage payments had not been made. The situation had been developing over time, but it had not been openly addressed, and more importantly, it had not been fully shared. An eviction was scheduled, April 26, 2010, the very next day after the shooting. In less than 24 hours, everything would have changed. The home would no longer be theirs. The situation would become public. The truth would be impossible to hide, and investigators begin to focus on a critical question. Did Heidi know? Because the answer to that question changes everything. If she was unaware, then the moment of exposure would have been sudden, unexpected, and potentially devastating. If she did know, then the pressure would have already been building. Either way, the timing becomes impossible to ignore. The incident occurred just hours before the eviction was set to take place, and that proximity in time introduces a new element into the investigation: pressure. Financial strain does not just affect numbers. It affects decisions. It creates urgency. It creates fear of exposure. And in some cases, it creates a need to avoid consequences. Investigators begin to consider how that pressure might connect to what happened. Because while the original story focused on an intruder from outside the home, this new information points in a different direction, one that does not involve forced entry, but instead involves something internal, something hidden, something that was about to come to light. With the financial situation now uncovered, investigators begin to look at it not just as background information, but as a potential factor that could have influenced decisions. Because financial pressure is not always visible from the outside. It builds quietly: missed payments, mounting obligations, limited options. Over time, those pressures can create a situation where the future feels uncertain. And when a deadline approaches, that pressure intensifies. In this case, that deadline was clear. The eviction was scheduled for the next day. There was no more time to delay, no more time to hide the situation. Everything was about to be exposed. Investigators begin to consider what that moment might have looked like: a situation where the truth could no longer remain hidden, a situation where consequences would become immediate: loss of a home, loss of stability, loss of trust, and potentially the loss of control over how everything would unfold. Because once something becomes public, it cannot be managed in the same way. It cannot be controlled. That loss of control becomes significant. Because control plays a role in decision-making, especially when pressure is high. Investigators begin to ask whether that pressure could have influenced what happened, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. Because in many cases, actions are not random. They are connected to circumstances. And in this case, the circumstances had changed dramatically in the hours leading up to the incident. The timing, the financial situation, the approaching exposure, all of it forms a context. And that context begins to reshape how the events are viewed. Because what once appeared to be an external threat is now being considered alongside internal pressure. And that shift in perspective becomes critical to the direction of the investigation. After the initial investigation, despite the questions and inconsistencies, no arrest is made. The case does not move forward in a decisive way. And over time, the urgency begins to fade. What was once an active investigation becomes quieter, less visible, less immediate. The explanation remains in place: a home invasion, an unknown intruder. And without new evidence to challenge it, that explanation continues to stand. Months pass, then years. And as time moves forward, the case begins to settle into a different category: unresolved. Not closed, but not actively progressing. Investigators continue to hold the information, but without something new, there is no clear direction to move in. This is what happens in many cases. When answers are incomplete but evidence is limited, time becomes a factor. Memories fade. Details become less sharp. Opportunities for new information become more rare. And the longer a case remains unresolved, the more difficult it becomes to change its course. For the people outside the investigation, the case becomes part of the past. Something that happened, something remembered, but no longer questioned. The story remains unchanged, a version of events that, over time, begins to feel accepted, not because it was fully proven, but because nothing replaced it. And that silence, that lack of movement, becomes part of the case itself. Because sometimes what keeps a case unresolved is not what is known, but what is missing. And in this case, for years, what was missing was enough to keep it from moving forward. After the initial investigation, despite the questions and inconsistencies, no arrest is made. The case does not move forward in a decisive way, and over time, the urgency begins to fade. What was once an active investigation becomes quieter, less visible, less immediate. The explanation remains in place: a home invasion, an unknown intruder, and without new evidence to challenge it, that explanation continues to stand. Months pass, then years, and as time moves forward, the case begins to settle into a different category. Unresolved. Not closed, but not actively progressing. Investigators continue to hold the information, but without something new, there is no clear direction to move in. This is what happens in many cases. When answers are incomplete, but evidence is limited, time becomes a factor. Memories fade, and details become less sharp. Opportunities for new information become more rare, and the longer a case remains unresolved, the more difficult it becomes to change its course. For the people outside the investigation, the case becomes part of the past. Something that happened, something remembered, but no longer questioned. The story remains unchanged, a version of events that, over time, begins to feel accepted, not because it was fully proven, but because nothing replaced it. And that silence, that lack of movement, becomes part of the case itself. Because sometimes what keeps a case unresolved is not what is known, but what is missing. And in this case, for years, what was missing was enough to keep it from moving forward. As the years pass without resolution, life begins to take on a new shape. For many people connected to the case, the event becomes something that happened in the past. A moment that cannot be changed, but also one that no longer dominates daily life. Time creates distance, and with that distance comes a sense of closure, even if the truth has not been fully established. Nick Firkus continues his life. He remarries. From the outside, everything appears to be moving forward. A new relationship, a new routine, a continuation of life beyond the events of that morning. And for those observing from a distance, that progression seems normal. Because when a case remains unresolved, people often rely on the explanation that already exists. The story of an intruder, a tragic situation, an accident during a struggle. Over time, that version of events becomes part of the background. Something accepted. And not because it has been proven beyond question, but because it has not been replaced by anything else. But even as life moves forward, the past does not disappear. It remains in place, unchanged. And sometimes it only takes one person, one perspective, to begin looking at that past differently. Because when something is left unresolved, it does not lose its importance. It simply waits. And in this case, that waiting period would eventually come to an end. Not because of new physical evidence discovered at the scene, but because of something else. A shift in perspective, a closer look at what had already been there. And that shift would begin with someone who was not there in 2010, but who would start asking questions years later. Years after the incident, a new perspective begins to form. It does not come from investigators at first, it comes from someone closer. Nick Firkus's second wife. She was not there in 2010. She did not experience the event directly. What she has is the version of the story that had been told. The explanation of an intruder, a break-in, a struggle, an accident. At first, that story is accepted, because it is presented with clarity, because it has already been repeated, because it appears to explain what happened. But over time, small details begin to stand out. Not major contradictions, not immediate red flags, just subtle inconsistencies, things that do not fully align, moments where the explanation feels incomplete, answers that do not fully connect. And those small details begin to accumulate, because when something is not entirely accurate, it often reveals itself in fragments, not all at once, but gradually, through observation, through repetition, through comparison. His second wife begins to question those details, not publicly, not immediately, but internally. And those questions begin to grow, because once doubt is introduced, it does not remain small, it expands. It looks for clarity, it looks for consistency, and when it does not find it, it begins to challenge what was once accepted. This is how perspectives change, not through one single discovery, but through a series of observations that no longer fit together. And in this case, those observations would lead to something significant, because sometimes the person who sees what others missed is not the one who was there in the beginning, but the one who comes later and sees the story with fresh eyes. As doubt begins to grow, it does not remain isolated. Questions lead to conversations, conversations lead to information, and gradually, details that were once overlooked begin to take on new meaning. The financial situation comes back into focus. The foreclosure, the missed mortgage payments, the eviction scheduled for the day after the shooting. These are not new facts. They existed at the time of the original investigation, but now they are being looked at differently. Not as background information, but as something central, something that directly connects to the timing of what happened. Because the sequence is clear. The home was about to be lost. The situation was about to become public. And then, just hours before that moment, everything changed. That connection becomes difficult to ignore, because timing is rarely coincidental in cases like this. When events happen close together, they often share a relationship. Investigators begin to reconsider how these elements fit together. The financial pressure, the approaching eviction, the explanation of an intruder, and the lack of evidence supporting that explanation. Each piece on its own may not provide an answer, but together they begin to form a pattern that suggests the original story may not fully explain what happened. This is the point where the case begins to shift, not through the discovery of something entirely new, but through the re-examination of what was already there. Because sometimes the truth is not hidden, it is simply not recognized. And once it is recognized, everything else begins to change. As the new perspective begins to take shape, the information does not remain isolated. It reaches investigators, and once it does, the case is no longer viewed the same way. Around 2019, the investigation is reopened, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because the existing pieces are now being seen differently. This time, the approach changes. The original explanation is no longer treated as the starting point. Instead, everything is questioned. Every statement, every assumption, every detail that was previously accepted. Investigators return to the case with fresh perspective. They review the scene again. The lack of forced entry, the absence of evidence supporting an intruder. They revisit the timeline, the precision of the events. In the sequence of the calls, they re-examine the financial situation, the foreclosure, the eviction scheduled for the following day. And they begin to look at how all of these elements connect, because now the case is not being built around a single explanation. It is being rebuilt from the ground up, without assumption, without bias, only evidence. And when a case is re-examined in this way, patterns become clearer. Connections that were once overlooked begin to stand out. What once seemed unrelated begins to align. The investigation gains direction, not based on something new, but based on a deeper understanding of what was already there. And that shift changes everything. Because once a case moves from assumption to analysis, it begins to move forward again. With the case reopened, investigators begin a detailed reanalysis of everything connected to the incident. Nothing is taken at face value. Everything is reviewed with a new lens. They return to the statements that were given, the description of an intruder, the explanation of a struggle, the sequence of events as it was originally presented, and they compare those statements to the physical evidence, the condition of the home, the lack of forced entry, the absence of disturbance. The results do not align. They move to the timeline again. The first call, the gunshot, the second call, they examine how those moments connect, what actions would need to occur within that time frame, and whether those actions are consistent with what was described. Again, inconsistencies begin to appear, not as isolated details, but as patterns. How patterns that suggest the original explanation does not fully account for what happened. Investigators also consider what is missing: no signs of entry, no signs of exit, no evidence of a third person. And that absence becomes part of the analysis, because in an event involving another individual, there is usually something left behind, some indication of presence. In this case, there is none. The more the evidence is reviewed, the clearer the situation becomes, not through a single discovery, but through the accumulation of inconsistencies, each detail reinforcing the next, until the original narrative can no longer stand on its own. And when that happens, the direction of the case changes, from questioning to focus. As the reanalysis continues, the case reaches a turning point. It is not a single moment, not one piece of evidence, but a gradual shift. The original explanation begins to lose its position. The idea of an intruder no longer holds the same weight, because every part of it now requires support that does not exist. No forced entry, no disturbance, no physical trace, no independent confirmation. What once seemed like a possible explanation now appears unsupported, and that changes the direction of the investigation, because when one explanation weakens, another begins to take its place. Investigators begin focusing more directly on what the evidence does support: the timeline, the controlled nature of the scene, the financial situation, the lack of external involvement. These elements begin to align, not perfectly, but enough to form direction. And that direction moves away from the idea of an unknown intruder towards something closer, something internal. The case begins to shift from uncertainty to structure, from possibility to focus. And once that shift happens, the investigation becomes more defined, more targeted, because instead of asking what might have happened, investigators begin asking what most likely happened. And that distinction matters, because it narrows the possibilities, it removes explanations that cannot be supported, and it strengthens the ones that remain. At this point, the case is no longer open in every direction. It is moving toward a conclusion, and that movement would soon lead to action. In 2021, more than a decade after the events of that morning, the case reaches a point where action is taken. Nick Firkus is arrested. The case, which had remained unresolved for years, is now moving forward. The investigation that was once quiet becomes active again. And this time, it is not centered on uncertainty. It is centered on a direction that has been built through reanalysis, timing, and consistency of evidence. The arrest marks a transition from investigation to accountability. In 2023, the case goes to trial in Ramsey County. For the first time, the details are presented in full view. The prosecution outlines the sequence of events: the 911 call, the gunshot, the second call, the condition of the scene, the lack of forced entry, the financial situation, the scheduled eviction. They present how these elements connect, how they align in a way that challenges the original explanation. The defense maintains the initial claim: an intruder, a struggle, an accidental discharge. They argue that the events unfolded as described in the early statements, but now both versions are being examined, not in isolation, but against the evidence. Each detail is considered, each inconsistency addressed, and as the trial progresses, the narrative that once stood unchallenged is now being tested under scrutiny. Because in a courtroom, a story is not enough. It must be supported. And when it is not, it begins to break apart. After the evidence is presented, the arguments made, and the timeline examined in full, the case reaches its final stage. The jury is given the responsibility to decide. They consider everything: the 911 call, the gunshot, the silence that followed, the second call, the explanation of an intruder. They compare that explanation to the physical evidence, the condition of the home, the absence of forced entry, the lack of disturbance. They consider the timeline, how events unfolded, how quickly everything occurred. They consider the financial situation, the foreclosure, the eviction scheduled for the next day, and how that timing connects to everything else. Each element on its own may raise questions, but together they form a complete picture, and that picture is what the jury must evaluate. After deliberation, a decision is reached. Guilty. Nick Firkus is convicted. He is sentenced to life in prison. The explanation that remained in place for years is rejected. The story of an intruder no longer stands. And with that decision, the case comes to an end. But the moment that started, everything remains unchanged. A 911 call, a voice asking for help, a sudden interruption, and a silence that followed. For years, that silence left unanswered questions, but over time, through investigation, re-examination, and persistence, those questions were addressed. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Because sometimes the truth is not hidden forever. It is uncovered, one detail at a time.